The corner of Washington and Cherry Streets in San Francisco's Presidio Heights neighborhood sits at the edge of one of the city's quieter residential grids. Broad streets, established houses, the kind of block where a parked car at night is unremarkable, where a yellow cab at the curb in the middle of October would have drawn no particular attention from anyone passing. On the night of October 11th, 1969, a cab registered to the Yellow Cab Company of San Francisco was parked at precisely that corner. The driver was Paul Stein, 29 years old, a graduate student at San Francisco State College, who drove the night shift to support his studies. The cab's engine was off. The street lamp was doing what street lamps do on quiet residential blocks, casting its particular pale circle on the pavement, illuminating nothing that required illuminating, indifferent to everything within it and beyond it. Paul Stein was the last person confirmed to have been killed by the Zodiac Killer. That confirmation has never been amended. 55 years of investigation, correspondence analysis, forensic review, and civilian research have not produced another name to place beside his in the official record of confirmed Zodiac homicides. The case did not end at Washington and Cherry Streets. The letters continued. The ciphers continued. The documented correspondence between the killer and the San Francisco Chronicle continued for years afterward. But the record of confirmed killings stops there, on that corner, on that night, with that cab and that engine off, and that street lamp casting its circle. What the investigation has never fully explained is why. This is not a small question. It is one of the case's most persistently documented problems, one that investigators, behavioral analysts, and researchers have returned to across decades without arriving at a conclusion the evidence fully supports. The Zodiac case is unusual in several respects, and the cessation of confirmed killings, sudden, complete, and entirely unaccompanied by any documented explanation, is among the most unusual of those respects. Serial offenders who stop without being caught are documented but uncommon. The record of what may have happened after October 1969 is a record of considered possibilities, carefully held, none of them confirmed. Before moving to those possibilities, the cab itself deserves a moment. It is worth understanding exactly what kind of crime scene Washington and Cherry Streets represented, because it was unlike anything that had preceded it in the confirmed Zodiac record. The earlier confirmed attacks had taken place at night, in rural and semi-rural locations, a lover's lane near Vallejo, a reservoir in Napa County, a park in the hills above the bay. They were, by the nature of those locations, isolated. The Presidio Heights neighborhood is not isolated. It is surrounded by houses. It is within a city. When San Francisco police officers responding to a radio call arrived at Washington and Cherry Streets that October night, they initially encountered a young man in a neighborhood close to the scene, whom they later determined had passed the actual suspect. The geography of the crime was urban in a way nothing before it in the confirmed record had been, and the killer had operated within it and then walked away through it into the city in the dark. Investigators documented this difference. The shift in location was noted in the case file as a potential indicator of changed methodology or increased confidence, though neither of those interpretations was formally confirmed. What it demonstrated, beyond any interpretive framework, was that the person responsible had been willing to operate within a populated urban environment on a Friday night in October and had done so without being apprehended. After that night, the confirmed record of Zodiac killings ends. The cab sat at the corner. The investigation continued. The killings, by official determination, did not. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, in its published materials on patterns of serial offender behavior, has noted that cessation without capture is statistically uncommon but documented. When investigators have examined the full population of identified serial offenders across the 20th century, the explanations for cessation without capture cluster into a small number of categories. Death of the offender accounts for a portion of these cases: natural death, accident, or suicide, each of which removes the person from the possibility of further offending without producing any official record connecting the death to the prior crimes. Incarceration for an unrelated offense accounts for another portion: cases in which the offender was removed from circulation by the criminal justice system without that system having any knowledge of the crimes it had also thereby prevented. Each of these explanations is held in the Zodiac case as a documented investigative possibility. Neither has been confirmed. The letter received in January 1974 by the San Francisco Chronicle complicated the incarceration theory without resolving it. The letter, broadly accepted by investigators as credibly originating from the Zodiac, based on its consistency with prior authenticated correspondence, referenced the film The Exorcist, a film that had been released in December 1973 and was generating considerable public and press attention in January of the following year. The person who wrote that letter was alive in January 1974. The person who wrote that letter was aware of current events, current films, current newspaper coverage, whatever had occurred between October 1969 and January 1974, more than 4 years, had not prevented the letter's author from being alive, aware, and in communication. That the letter was received at all says something specific about the period between October 1969 and January 1974. It says that period was not empty. It does not say what filled it. The editors at the San Francisco Chronicle, who received that letter in January 1974, had by then been receiving Zodiac communications for years. The first authenticated Zodiac letters had arrived in the summer of 1969, addressed simultaneously to the Chronicle, the Vallejo Times-Herald, and the San Francisco Examiner. Those letters had arrived with evidence, portions of a plaid shirt cut from the clothing of one of the confirmed victims, held back from public disclosure so that investigators could use the detail to evaluate subsequent claimed communications. By January 1974, the editors who handled the incoming letter were handling a document they had institutional experience with. They had a frame of reference. The letter was identified as credible correspondence and forwarded to investigators. The Chronicle building on 5th Street in San Francisco is a specific physical location, and the letter it received in January 1974 is a specific physical object, a sheet of paper handled by specific people on a specific date, containing a specific reference to a specific film that had been in theaters for a matter of weeks. Investigators examined it. It entered the case file. It remained the last Zodiac communication, broadly accepted as credibly authentic, a position it has held in the record for more than 50 years. Between that letter and the corner of Washington and Cherry Streets, the case record contains something that investigators have found more difficult to describe than a simple absence. It contains continued correspondence, letters and cards received between October 1969 and January 1974, alongside the complete absence of any confirmed homicide attributable to the Zodiac. Those two facts together form a documented tension at the center of the case that no single investigative theory has fully resolved. One investigative direction that formal researchers have documented explores the possibility that the killings did not stop. Within this line of analysis, what stopped was the letters, or rather, what stopped was the connection between letters and crimes. The confirmed Zodiac killings in California were identified as such in significant part because the killer wrote to claim them, because the communications provided evidence that linked specific letters to specific crimes, because there was a feedback loop between the physical acts and the written record that made attribution possible. The FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, which would eventually provide a national database for linking crimes across jurisdictional boundaries, was not established until 1985. In 1970, in 1971, in 1972, a crime committed in one California county had no automatic mechanism by which it would be evaluated for connection to crimes committed in another. A crime committed in a different state had even less. The jurisdictional landscape of American law enforcement in the early 1970s was, by documented historical account, fragmented in ways that contemporary readers may find difficult to fully appreciate. County sheriff's departments, municipal police forces, state investigative agencies, and federal bureaus each maintained their own filing systems, their own case records, their own investigative protocols, and their own thresholds for what constituted a lead worth pursuing across a boundary line. A road atlas of the western United States from that period would show the state lines and county divisions that defined those jurisdictions, each one a hard boundary for information sharing that had no computerized equivalent and no national clearinghouse to bridge the gaps. A killer who moved across those boundaries, or who simply stopped identifying himself through letters, would have produced an evidentiary silence that could not be easily distinguished from a genuine cessation. This is not a claim that additional crimes occurred. The evidentiary record does not contain that claim. What investigators and researchers have formally documented is the structural possibility, grounded in the historical reality, of what law enforcement information sharing looked like in the early 1970s, that crimes committed without beginning correspondence would have been extraordinarily difficult to connect to an ongoing investigation that relied substantially on written communication for its attribution framework. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit documented this investigative gap in published materials on the case, noting the absence of a coordinated national crime database as a factor relevant to evaluating what the cessation of confirmed Zodiac activity may or may not represent. The question of relocation, examined in several formal analyses of the case, holds a specific place in the investigative record. California in 1970 was still a relatively young state with a mobile, transient population. The Bay Area in particular had been the destination for enormous numbers of people who had arrived in the preceding decade for reasons as varied as economic opportunity, the counterculture, military deployment, and the general westward demographic drift that the post-war period had accelerated. The person or persons responsible for the confirmed Zodiac killings was never identified, which means that person's biographical circumstances, where they came from, where they may have gone, whether their residence in the Bay Area was permanent or temporary, remain entirely unknown. A person who relocated would have left no trace in a record that had never definitively established their presence to begin with. Behavioral analysts working from the documented profile of the Zodiac have noted that the letter writing itself, in the period after October 1969, appears to have taken on an independent function. This observation is grounded in specific documentary evidence. The letters continued, the ciphers continued, the claims and demands and self-referential commentary continued, but the crimes to which those communications might have referred did not appear in the official record. Analysts working within frameworks developed by the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit have proposed that for an offender whose primary psychological reward came from domination and perceived control over a wide audience, a crowd of readers, a newspaper readership, an investigating police force, the correspondence itself may have been functioning as the primary arena of that dominance, replacing or partially substituting for the physical crimes that had generated the audience in the first place. The evidence cited in support of this framework is in the documents themselves. The Zodiac's letters, from the first summer of confirmed correspondence through the last authenticated communication in January 1974, show a consistent pattern of escalating elaborateness. Early letters included ciphered messages presented as challenges. Later letters included increasingly detailed demands, specific references to newspaper coverage of his crimes, claimed tallies of victims that far exceeded any confirmed count, and a tone that researchers have described as oriented toward the maintenance of public attention rather than toward the announcement of specific crimes. The physical crimes appear in the first half of the confirmed correspondence period. The documented letters continue after the physical crimes stop. Whether this pattern reflects a genuine substitution of correspondence for crime, or simply reflects the absence of a mechanism to link additional crimes to the established California case, the evidence does not confirm. The January 1974 letter described the film The Exorcist and gave itself a rating, the best by the Zodiac's own written assessment, presumably measured against the film's own frightening content. The framing is specific, a person writing about a film currently in theaters, positioning himself relative to a cultural conversation happening in real time, maintaining the posture of a figure with an audience. The tone of the letter is self-referential in the way earlier Zodiac letters had been self-referential, alert to how the writer was being perceived, calibrated toward maintaining a particular kind of presence in the mind of the reader. It arrived more than 4 years after the last confirmed killing. The editors at the Chronicle received it, identified it, and forwarded it to investigators. A stack of authenticated Zodiac letters, arranged in chronological order on a research surface, would show something that documents in that configuration sometimes make visible, a pattern of presence and absence. The earlier letters in the stack would sit alongside the documented case records of the confirmed killings, each letter referencing a crime, each crime generating a letter, the correspondence and the physical acts woven together into a single case record. The later letters would stand alone. The correspondence continues past the point where the parallel record of physical crimes ends, and the letters in the later part of the stack have no confirmed crimes beside them to complete the pattern. They are the correspondence half of a pattern, whose other half is not documented. This arrangement does not resolve anything. What it shows, without interpretation, is that the two things that defined the Zodiac case in its first operational year, confirmed killings and claimed letters, stopped being documented simultaneously at some point after October 1969. The killings stopped appearing in the confirmed record. The letters continued for several more years, and then they too stopped, ending with the January 1974 communication about The Exorcist. After that, the official record of Zodiac correspondence holds only silence. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, in its categorization of the Zodiac case among documented examples of serial offenders who ceased activity without capture, placed the case within a framework that acknowledges how rarely silence of this kind is fully explained. The materials in which the Zodiac case appears as a numbered reference represent years of comparative work across multiple offender histories, each one examined for the patterns that allow investigators to make probabilistic assessments about future behavior and about the meaning of behavioral shifts. The Zodiac case appears in those materials as a case where the cessation of confirmed activity preceded any known resolution, death, incarceration, identification, and where the follow-on question of what that cessation represented has never been answered by the evidentiary record. What the evidentiary record contains in its most current form is a set of facts that researchers have arranged and rearranged across decades without arriving at a settled configuration. The confirmed killings ended in October 1969. The confirmed correspondence continued through January 1974. The years between those dates and the present hold no confirmed additional Zodiac crimes, no confirmed identification of the offender, no confirmed explanation for why the killings stopped when they did, and no confirmed understanding of what the killer's life looked like after the last letter arrived at the Chronicle. That corner in Presidio Heights has been there all along. Washington and Cherry Streets have not changed their geography. The neighborhood that surrounded that cab on the night of October 11th, 1969, is still there, still residential, still quiet by the standards of a major city, still the kind of block where a parked cab at the curb would draw no particular attention. The physical location is documented. The crime committed there is documented. The investigation that followed it is documented. Its files maintained in official storage. Its case status held as open. The pause that follows, the sudden, unannounced, apparently permanent withdrawal from confirmed activity, is documented only as the absence of documentation. The confirmed record simply stops, and then, 4 years later, a letter arrives referencing a film, and then that too stops, and the silence that follows is held for more than 50 years without being explained. None of the investigators who worked the case, none of the behavioral analysts who have reviewed it through forensic frameworks developed in the decades since 1969, and none of the civilian researchers who have devoted sustained effort to the correspondence and the cipher material have produced a documented explanation for why a person who killed and wrote letters for 16 months and then wrote letters without confirmed killings for another 4 years eventually stopped doing both. The structural explanations held in the investigative record, death, incarceration, relocation, behavioral substitution, are each grounded in documented precedent from comparative case analysis. None of them has been confirmed as the explanation for this case. The January 1974 letter sits in the case file alongside every other piece of authenticated Zodiac correspondence. The earliest July 1969 letters, the ciphered messages, the cards and envelopes, and clipped newsprint and handwritten claims, a physical stack of documents that represents what the official record contains. The letter that mentions the exorcist is the last item in that chronological sequence. After it, the documented correspondence holds nothing else that investigators have broadly accepted as credibly authentic. The sequence ends there, on a sheet of paper received by editors in January 1974, a film title referenced, a self-assigned rating claimed, the writer apparently still alive and still attending to the cultural moment. The space between October 1969 and January 1974 holds no confirmed Zodiac crimes. That is what the record shows. The space between January 1974 and the present holds no confirmed Zodiac crimes and no confirmed Zodiac correspondence. That is also what the record shows. What the record does not show, what it has never shown, what no investigative theory has so far been able to supply, is an account of what happened inside those spaces, what the person who drove a cab to a corner in Presidio Heights and then wrote a letter about a film did with the years that accumulated on either side of those documented moments. The cab sat at the corner of Washington and Cherry Streets, with its engine off, and the street lamp doing what street lamps do. The letter arrived at the Chronicle in January 1974 on a day indistinguishable from any other day that month, handled by editors who had developed the institutional familiarity of people who have been receiving unusual correspondence for years. Both of those objects, the cab, the letter, are part of the documented record. Both of them have been examined at length. Between them and after them, the record holds its particular quality of settled, accumulating quiet, the kind that comes not from resolution, but from the simple passage of time around an unanswered question that has been carefully held for longer than most people have been alive. The last confirmed Zodiac killing was October 11th, 1969. The last letter broadly accepted as authentically his arrived in January 1974. In the space between those two dates, and in all the time since, the case record has continued to hold what it has always held, a documented beginning, a documented end of confirmed activity, and no documented account of what came between them or what came after the silence began. That is not an explanation, it is the shape of what the record contains, and the shape of what, after more than 5 decades of careful attention, it still does not. On the 26th of July, 1970, a letter arrived bearing a number. The number was 37. It appeared in the Zodiac's hand, or in the characters of whatever typeface or script he had chosen that day. Set down as a count, a tally, a claim made without supporting detail, and without any list of names attached to it. The letter was postmarked and received. It was logged. It became part of the case record, alongside everything else the investigation had accumulated by that summer, and the number it carried, 37, has remained one of the most examined and least resolved facts in the entire file. That number was not an accident of phrasing. It was a specific, deliberate claim that the Zodiac had killed 37 people. The investigation by that point had officially confirmed 5 murders attributable to him. The gap between those two figures, between 5 and 37, is not a gap that subsequent investigation has ever formally closed, and it is not a gap that can be closed by inference or approximation. It is a gap defined by evidentiary standards, and understanding those standards is the only honest way to follow what the record actually shows. The 5 names that constitute the confirmed record are not abstractions. They were people. David Faraday was 17 years old, a student, found on a road in Solano County in December 1968. Betty Lou Jensen was 16. She had been David Faraday's date that evening. She was found close to where he was found, on the same cold road, on the same winter night. Darlene Farron was 22 years old, a waitress, a mother, a person described by those who knew her as warm and socially at ease in the world. She was killed at Blue Rock Springs Park in July 1969. Brian Hartnell survived his attack at Lake Berryessa in September 1969 with serious injuries. Cecilia Shepard, who had been with him, did not survive. Paul Stein was 29 years old, a graduate student working as a cab driver, and he was killed in San Francisco's Presidio Heights neighborhood in October of that same year. These 5 deaths and the survived attack on Brian Hartnell are what the California investigation, applying the evidentiary standards developed across years of careful work, has confirmed with the level of certainty the case record supports. The standards applied to those confirmations were not arbitrary. California investigators developed a specific set of requirements for attributing a crime to the Zodiac, and those requirements were grounded in the physical and documentary evidence the case had produced. Direct physical evidence, the kind that placed the killer at a specific scene in a way consistent with other confirmed attacks, was one component. Written communications that specifically referenced the crime in question from the killer himself constituted another. Geographic and behavioral consistency with the established pattern of confirmed attacks was assessed as a factor, and in some cases, the Zodiac had provided what investigators could examine as near-direct authentication, fabric cut from a victim's clothing, through sent within a letter to the press or police, a practice documented in several of the authenticated communications and constituting a specific form of physical linkage between the correspondence and the crimes. Without meeting those standards, or a sufficient combination of them, a crime could not be formally attributed. This was not a failure of the investigation, and it was the investigation doing precisely what it was designed to do, holding the line between what the evidence shows and what the evidence suggests, between what can be confirmed and what can only be considered. That distinction is the difference between a case record and a theory, and maintaining it even when it produces an uncomfortable gap between a killer's claims and an official count is the only way the record retains any value at all. The 37, then, sits in the case file as what it always was, a claim made by the Zodiac in a letter, unaccompanied by any information that would allow investigators to test it. No names, no locations, no dates, no identifying details that could be cross-referenced against unsolved homicides in the relevant geography. The number exists as a stated figure on a page, and the investigation exists as the record of what could be confirmed, and between those two things the gap remains. Among the cases that have been examined, and examined seriously, in the context of that gap, one involves a young woman named Donna Lass. She was 25 years old in the autumn of 1970. She worked as a nurse, and her last confirmed employment was at Harrah's Casino in South Lake Tahoe. In September of that year, she failed to report for her shift. She was not there when she was expected to be. Attempts to locate her did not succeed. She had, by the account the record holds, simply stopped appearing in the places where she was supposed to appear, without explanation and without a confirmed record of where she went. Her case became informally associated with the Zodiac investigation through a postcard received by the San Francisco Chronicle in 1971. The postcard carried imagery that investigators examined in the context of what they knew about Donna Lass, imagery associated with mountains, and through coded visual reference, what some analysts read as a suggestion of a location connected to her disappearance. The postcard was a physical object. It was handled by editors at the Chronicle, who by 1971 had received Zodiac communications before and had developed a practiced eye for the material. It was logged, it was examined, the analysis of its imagery and any possible connection to Donna Lass was documented in the investigative record. That attribution, though, was never officially confirmed. The postcard and the imagery it carried were noted as potentially associated with her case. The case itself was never formally added to the list of crimes attributed to the Zodiac. Donna Lass's body was never found. The specific circumstances of her disappearance remain, in the case record, unresolved. A disappearance without a confirmed account of what happened and without the evidentiary foundation that would allow investigators to formally close the distance between her case and the Zodiac file. The association between them exists in the investigative record as a documented question, examined carefully and left with equal care without a definitive answer. The Donna Lass case belongs to the category of questions the investigation has held and examined without resolving. There is another case that belongs to a different, and in some ways more structurally complex category, one that predates the confirmed Zodiac killings entirely, and that sits at the edge of the official record without being inside it. Cherry Jo Bates was 18 years old. She was a student at Riverside City College in Southern California. On the 30th of October, 1966, 2 years before the night on Lago Trinidad Road, when the confirmed Zodiac killings began, she was murdered. Her body was found near the campus library. The investigation that followed was conducted by Riverside Police in a city and a jurisdiction geographically removed from the Bay Area cases that would subsequently define the Zodiac investigation, and for a period of time, those two threads existed separately, without any formal connection being drawn between them. The connection emerged through the correspondence. Letters were sent to the Riverside Police Department and to a local newspaper in 1966 and 1967, communications that referenced the Bates murder, that used language and phrasing that analysts examining the authenticated Zodiac letters found distinctive and specific. Handwriting analysis was conducted. Side-by-side comparisons were prepared. The letter forms from the Riverside communications on one side, the letter forms from authenticated Zodiac letters on the other, with typed annotations noting where the similarities appeared and where the differences, if any, could be observed. Riverside police investigators worked through that analysis and reached a conclusion, not a certainty, but a reasoned investigative finding, that the letters sent in connection with the Bates murder were credibly linked to the same hand responsible for the Zodiac correspondence. That conclusion placed the Riverside case in a peculiar and enduring position within the broader record. Riverside investigators found the connection credible. The handwriting analysis supported it. The phrasing supported it. And yet the Cherry Jo Bates murder has never been formally added to the confirmed Zodiac victim list, and the 5 names that constitute the official count remain 5. The case stands at the edge of the file, not fully inside, not fully outside, the boundary between those two positions, drawn by evidentiary standards, that the available documentation, for all its suggestive weight, has not fully satisfied to the level required for formal attribution. To follow the Riverside case carefully is to understand something important about how the confirmed record was assembled and why its edges remain where they do. The conservative standard applied to Zodiac attributions was not designed to minimize the count or to resist the possibility of additional victims. It was designed to ensure that what the record says is what the evidence actually shows, that the file, when consulted by anyone who needs to work from it, contains claims that have been tested and held, not claims that have been accepted on the weight of their plausibility alone. Plausibility is not the same as confirmation. The investigation understood this, and the record it produced reflects that understanding, even where that understanding generates discomfort in the space it leaves open. The California Department of Justice maintained files on a number of ancillary cases reviewed for possible Zodiac connection. These were not informal curiosities. They were formally tracked, assigned, examined by investigators who treated the question of additional victims as a genuine investigative priority rather than a marginal concern. Documents released through public records requests over the years have confirmed that the department's approach to this question was methodical, that the files it kept, the cases it reviewed, and the standards it applied were part of a sustained institutional effort to determine whether the gap between 5 and 37 contained anything that could be confirmed. What those documents show is that the question was taken seriously. What they also show is that no additional attributions resulted. The cases reviewed were examined against the established criteria, physical evidence, written communications referencing the crime, geographic and behavioral consistency, physical authentication, and none of them, across the full record of that review process, met the standard required for formal attribution. The files remain. The review process is documented. The outcomes are documented. The gap remains. There is a manila folder somewhere in the state's case management system that holds the typed summaries and evidence photographs of each ancillary case that was reviewed and not attributed. Each one carries a reference number. Each summary represents an investigator's time, a family's uncertainty, a question that the file could not ultimately answer. The folder is not the resolution of anything. It is the record of a sustained effort to approach the question honestly, and its contents document both the seriousness with which investigators engage the possibility of additional victims and the evidentiary basis on which each case, individually, could not be moved from the column of possibilities to the column of confirmed facts. The July 26, 1970 letter, the one bearing the number 37, was addressed, as many Zodiac communications were, to the press. It was handled, it was read, it was logged into the investigative record alongside the coded messages, the costume descriptions, the fabric samples, the fingerprint attempts, and everything else the case had produced in the 18 months since the first confirmed murders. The number it carried was examined against the confirmed count, 5, at the time, and found to leave a gap of 32, unaccounted for. That gap has been the subject of analysis by researchers across the decades since, and the honest conclusion reached by those analyses, when held to the evidentiary standard the investigation itself applied, is the same conclusion the investigation reached. The gap exists. It has been examined. It has not been closed. The 37 is a number on a page. The 5 confirmed names are the evidentiary record. Between them, the investigation has documented the space carefully, examined the available possibilities with the seriousness the question deserves, and found nothing that meets the threshold required to formally change the count in the official record. What remains is the record itself, and the record, followed carefully, tells a specific kind of story. It tells the story of a case built on rigorous standards, producing a confirmed list that is small but defensible, surrounded by a larger field of questions that the record has documented and held without resolving. It tells the story of investigators who understood the difference between what could be confirmed and what could only be considered, and who maintained that distinction even when the subject of their investigation was asserting a count 32 higher than what they could verify. And it tells the story of the gap, not as a failure, not as a mystery that demands a dramatic resolution, but as an honest feature of the record, preserved in the files of the California Department of Justice and in the authenticated Zodiac correspondence that generated the question in the first place. There is something particular about the way those authenticated letters sit in chronological sequence. The earlier ones, the ones from late 1968 and through 1969, correspond to documented events. There is a crime, and then there is a letter about the crime, and the letter carries physical authentication, a piece of fabric, a specific detail only someone present at the scene would know, a code referencing a location in terms consistent with the confirmed geography. The latter letters stand differently. They make claims. The count of 37 references to actions and events not tied to any confirmed crime, without the same physical anchor, and the investigation, encountering them with the same careful attention it brought to everything in the file, found that careful attention was not enough to verify what they asserted. The number 37 appeared on a specific day, in a specific letter, in a specific year. It has been in the record since then. The 5 confirmed names have been in the record longer, each one established through the kind of documentation that withstands examination. And the space between them, the 32 that have no confirmed cases attached to them, has been held in the record too, as a documented question. as a formally tracked investigative inquiry, as the honest residue of a process that tried to close the gap and found that the evidence, examined on its own terms, would not support that closure. The postcard connected to Donna Lass, the one received by the San Francisco Chronicle in 1971, with its mountain imagery and its coded reference to a young woman who had simply not shown up for her shift one September morning, is still part of the record. It is a small physical object, a few inches across, its surface carrying whatever was printed on it and whatever was handwritten or cut and pasted there, and it carries the weight of a question the investigation spent time with and could not answer. Donna Lass was 25 years old when she disappeared. The postcard arrived about a year later. The connection between them, in the terms the case record uses, is a documented investigative association, examined, noted, and left, with the honesty that characterizes the best of what the investigation produced as unconfirmed. The side-by-side handwriting comparison documents, prepared by analysts working on the Riverside letters, are a different kind of object. They are flat, technical, annotated, the kind of document that records careful comparative work rather than impression or intuition. The letter forms are there, 2 sets of them, and the annotations beside them mark what the analyst observed, where the formations match, where they diverge. If they diverge, what the pattern of similarities and differences allows the analyst to conclude within the terms of their professional practice. Those documents reached a conclusion that Riverside investigators found credible. They did not reach a conclusion that the broader Zodiac investigation found sufficient to formally add Cherry Joe Bates's name to the confirmed list. Both of those things are true simultaneously, and the record holds both of them without collapsing either one. Riverside City College on the 30th of October, 1966, was a campus in Southern California on the last evening of October, with the ordinary geography of a community college, the library building, the parking area, the paths between buildings that students walked without particular attention on any normal evening. Cherry Joe Bates walked that campus that night. She was 18. She was a student. She had her ordinary life arranged around her in the way that the lives of 18-year-olds are arranged, with the future still forming and the present still close and specific. What happened near that library is documented in the Riverside investigation as a confirmed homicide. What connects that homicide to the Zodiac investigation is documented in the handwriting analyses and the letter comparisons as a credible investigative association. What formally places it, or does not place it within the confirmed Zodiac record, is the evidentiary standard that the investigation applied consistently to every question the case generated. That campus still exists. The case file still exists. The handwriting comparison documents still exist, somewhere in the record system that holds such things, alongside the Riverside police investigation and the letters that generated the question and the analytical work that examined it, the question those documents address. Whether the hand that wrote to the Riverside police in 1966 and 1967 was the same hand that wrote to the San Francisco Chronicle and the San Francisco Police Department in 1969 and after is documented in the record as a question examined and held open, not resolved in either direction with the certainty that formal attribution would require. The 37 sits in the record alongside the 5. It has always been there. The investigation has always known what it is, a claim made in writing by the person who sent the letter without supporting documentation that would allow the claim to be verified. The 5 names are different. They are confirmed. They are supported by physical evidence, by authenticated correspondence, by the accumulated documentary record of investigations that worked carefully through each case and reached a conclusion they could defend. The gap between those two numbers has been examined by investigators, by researchers, by analysts working through public records requests, and by independent researchers who have spent years in the documentary record of the case. None of them, working from the evidentiary standards the investigation established, has formally closed the distance between 37 and 5. What the record shows in its most complete form is this: a case with a confirmed core, surrounded by a documented field of questions, each one held at the level of honest uncertainty the evidence supports. The 5 confirmed victims are named in the record with the weight of everything that confirmed them. The 37 is named in the record as a claim made in a letter postmarked July 26, 1970. Between those two facts, the investigation accumulated a careful, serious, sustained body of work, files kept, cases reviewed, comparisons conducted, analyses prepared, and that body of work documents not a failure to find additional victims, but a rigorous and honest effort to determine what the evidence could actually support. The campus at Riverside City College carries its history without annotation. The library building is where it was. The parking area is where it was. The October evening in 1966 is in the past by a distance that has grown considerably since the case file was first assembled. Cherry Jo Bates was 18 years old. Her name is in the Riverside investigation as the confirmed subject of a homicide. Her name is in the Zodiac adjacent case record as the subject of an investigative association that Riverside investigators found credible and that the broader Zodiac investigation has never formally confirmed or formally excluded. The case file that holds her name in both of those forms remains where case files remain, in the record, documented, held, the edges of its connection to the Zodiac drawn by evidentiary standards that have not yet been moved. The gap between 5 and 37 is the gap the record has always shown. It is not a comfortable gap. It is not a resolved gap, but it is an honest one, preserved with care, examined with seriousness, and held in the documented record of the California investigation, exactly as the evidence requires it to be held, open, noted, specific in its documented contents, and still, after all the review the case has received, without a formal answer to the question of what fills it. The number 37 is still there, on a letter postmarked in the summer of 1970, carrying its claim without any accompanying list of names or locations. The 5 confirmed names are still there, each supported by the documentary and physical record that placed them in the confirmed column rather than the possible one, and at the edges of that record, in the Donna Lass postcard, in the Riverside handwriting comparisons. In the California Department of Justice files on ancillary cases reviewed and not attributed, the investigation's careful, sustained, and unresolved engagement with the question of what lies between those two numbers persists as its own kind of document, thorough, honest, and still at the level of formal confirmation, incomplete. The edges of this case have never been drawn with certainty. They have been approached carefully, examined with the tools the investigation had available, and left where the evidence placed them, not further in, not further out, but held precisely at the point where what can be confirmed ends and what can only be considered begins. That boundary is not a failure of the record. It is the record doing what a careful record does, marking the limit of what is known and holding everything beyond that limit with the honesty that the people in this case, the confirmed dead, the disappeared, the names attached to letters and comparisons, and unresolved investigative associations have always deserved. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, in its published analytical work on serial offenders, characterized the Zodiac Killer as an individual whose primary psychological reward appeared to derive not from the physical commission of crimes, but from the sustained, deliberate performance of power over investigators, journalists, and the reading public. This framing, documented in institutional materials and referenced in academic criminological literature, is one of the more specific and consequential conclusions that formal analysis of the case has produced. It shifts the center of gravity away from the confirmed crime scenes and toward the accumulated weight of the letters themselves, treating the correspondence not as a secondary feature of the case, but as its operational core. That conclusion did not emerge from intuition. It emerged from analysis of what the record actually shows: the timing of the letters, their content, their escalating demands, the elaborate constructions within them, and the way their volume and complexity changed over time. Each of those elements taken individually would suggest relatively little. Taken together, as a pattern documented across more than 4 years of active communication, they form the evidential foundation for a specific kind of behavioral portrait, partial, contested in some of its details, but grounded in a documented body of forensic and criminological analysis that investigators have continued to develop and refine across the decades since the case was first opened. What the analysis begins with is the letters themselves, not what they said about the crimes exactly, but when they arrived and what they demanded. The timing of several early letters was keyed precisely to newspaper coverage, responses to specific articles, references to specific editorial choices, instructions about where on the front page his coded communications were to appear. A letter received in August 1969 specified that the 3-part cipher it contained was to be printed on the front page within a week, and that failure to comply would result in further violence. The demand was not incidental. It was the point. The physical crime had occurred. The letter was the continuation of it, through a different mechanism and in a different arena. Investigators at the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, applying analytical frameworks developed through the unit's systematic interviewing of incarcerated serial offenders in the 1970s and 1980s, noted that this pattern, physical crime followed by public communication that leveraged the crime as a form of continuing threat and demonstration, was consistent with offenders whose gratification derived primarily from dominance and control rather than from any element more directly tied to the physical act. John Douglas and Robert Ressler, whose investigative work formed the institutional foundation of the unit's behavioral profiling methodology, contributed substantially to the analytical vocabulary through which the Zodiac case would later be examined in retrospect. Their published work on offender typology, while not developed specifically in response to the Zodiac case, provided frameworks that researchers and investigators have consistently applied to it in the years since. The Behavioral Science Unit's characterization described the Zodiac as likely a white male of average to above average intelligence, socially functional enough to sustain ordinary life without attracting immediate suspicion, and operating from a motivational structure in which dominance and perceived control over a large audience were primary drivers. Sexual motivation, in its conventional forensic sense, was not identified as central to the behavioral profile, which placed the Zodiac in a category of offender in which power itself, the experience of controlling the actions of others, of being attended to, of generating responses, was the operative reward. This profile was never confirmed against a specific individual. It remained, and remains, a working analytical construct derived from behavioral evidence in the documentary record. The letters that arrived throughout 1969, 1970, and into the early 1970s provided the most detailed behavioral record available. They arrived at specific addresses: the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, the Vallejo Times-Herald, and in one documented case directly to the office of the attorney Melvin Belly. And their construction varied in ways that analysts found significant. Some were handwritten, some incorporated ciphers, some included physical pieces of evidence, portions of a victim's shirt removed at the scene of the October 1969 killing as authenticating material. The inclusion of that physical evidence was not practically necessary. Its purpose was demonstrative. The killer was establishing, through the letter itself, that the communication was authentic and that the crimes had been his. That demonstrative quality, the insistence on being believed, on being accurately credited, has been cited by behavioral analysts as one of the more telling features of the correspondence. The July 1970 letter, claiming a tally of 37 victims, was not accompanied by a list of names or locations that investigators could verify. The number was asserted and left unanchored. What it communicated was not information in any recoverable sense. It communicated scale, and by extension, a specific kind of authority. The writer was positioning himself, through the letter, as someone whose accumulation of power exceeded what investigators had been able to document. Whether or not the number was accurate was, from the behavioral analysis perspective, somewhat secondary to the function the claim was serving. Robert Hare's research on psychopathy and the broader academic literature on the fantasy-to-action cycle in serial offenders provides one of the more frequently cited analytical frameworks for understanding how the correspondence functioned psychologically. The research supports the interpretation that for certain offenders, written communication can serve as a partial fulfillment of the same psychological needs otherwise met by physical crimes. What changes in this framework is the medium, not the underlying structure of the gratification. The Zodiac's letters in this reading were not incidental or secondary to the crimes. They were continuous with them. The escalating elaborateness of the communications, ciphers requiring mathematical or cryptographic knowledge to decode. Letters composed from clipped newspaper type, coded imagery and postcards, references to contemporary popular culture, is consistent with the written correspondence functioning increasingly as the primary arena of operation for an offender whose core psychological drive was toward the experience of dominance and display. The ciphers themselves deserve specific attention in this context. The first of them arrived in 3 parts, distributed across 3 different Bay Area newspapers in August 1969. Each part was addressed to a different publication. The cipher required assembly. The 3 sections had to be brought together before the whole could be read. This structure ensured that the task of decoding would require coordination across newsrooms and eventually involving investigators and cryptographers. The puzzle was not designed to be easily solved. It was designed to be worked on publicly, with effort, over time. The solution, when a pair of high school teachers in Salinas named Donald and Betty Hardin published their proposed decryption, revealed a text that confirmed the writer's awareness of how the correspondence was being received and processed. He had known it would be worked on. He had, in the analytical framing, designed it to generate sustained attention. Subsequent ciphers were more resistant. The 408-character cipher, so designated by the number of its symbols, yielded to the Hardin solution within weeks of its publication. The 340-character cipher, sent in November 1969, remained unsolved for more than 50 years. It was not decoded until November 2020, when a team of civilian researchers led by David Orenchak, working alongside a mathematician named Sam Blake and a computer programmer named Jarl Van Eyck submitted a solution to the FBI that the Bureau confirmed was accurate. The plaintext of the 340 cipher, once decoded, contained taunting references to investigators and continued the same tone of deliberate provocation and claimed superiority documented in the written letters. What the cipher said was less analytically significant than the fact of its construction. Its specific design features ensured that it would resist conventional frequency analysis and require computational methods unavailable in 1969, which is consistent with the construction having been designed to be unsolvable rather than merely challenging. The behavioral interpretation of this is specific. Criminal evaded primarily by attention and dominance would derive maximum benefit from a communication that generated sustained effort that kept investigators, academics, and the public working on it, attending to it, returning to it over an indefinitely extended period. A cipher solved in a week generates a specific bounded quantity of attention. A cipher that remains open for decades generates something qualitatively different. Whether the 340-character cipher was designed with that understanding in mind cannot be confirmed. What can be said is that its design produced that outcome, and that the outcome is consistent with the motivational framework the behavioral analysis identifies. Moving from the written record to the physical crime scenes, the behavioral evidence accumulates in a different register. The attack at Lake Berryessa in Napa County on September 27, 1969, was documented in survivor accounts and in subsequent physical evidence in ways that revealed a specific kind of preparation. Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard, who were picnicking near the shore of the reservoir, were approached by a figure wearing a distinctive costume, a black executioner-style hood constructed from fabric with a crosshair symbol stitched onto the bib at its front. The hood covered the attacker's face and head entirely. Its construction was deliberate and specific. Investigators who documented the encounter through Hartnell's subsequent account noted that the hood had no practical concealment purpose at the distance at which the attacker initially presented himself. He was visible from a considerable distance before approaching, and the hood could not have made identification more difficult at range than a simple hat or scarf would have. Its purpose was something other than concealment. And forensic psychologists examining the behavioral evidence of the Lake Berryessa attack have identified the costume as staging behavior, the deliberate construction and deployment of a physical object that serves the offender's internal psychological narrative rather than any operational purpose. The crosshair symbol stitched onto the hood was the same symbol the Zodiac had already adopted in his correspondence and used as a signature. Wearing it, physically embodying it, in the commission of a crime was a specific kind of act. It projected the identity that had been constructed through the letters into the physical space of the crime scene. The person approaching Hartnell and Shepard at the lake's edge was not simply a person committing a violent act. He was, in the behavioral reading, performing a role that had been developed through months of written construction, arriving at the crime scene already costumed in the identity the correspondence had established. That kind of staging behavior, the deliberate preparation and assembly of a physical prop with symbolic rather than operational significance, has been identified by researchers as associated with offenders who have a highly developed internal fantasy about the meaning of their crimes. The fantasy in this framing is not the crime itself. It is a larger narrative within which the crime is situated, a narrative in which the offender occupies a specific symbolic role. The construction of the hood, the stitching of the crosshair symbol, the deliberate choice to wear it, all of these elements are consistent with an offender who had, through the correspondence and through some internal process that the correspondence reflected, developed a highly elaborated sense of what his crimes meant and who he was in relation to them. The written communication following the Lake Berryessa attack included a reference to the attack written on the door of Hartnell's car, discovered by investigators at the scene. The killer had returned to the parked vehicle after the attack and written on it in felt-tip pen the dates and locations of his previous attacks, presented as a list, with the Lake Berryessa attack added at the bottom and designated as the most recent entry. This was not communication directed at investigators in the way the letters were. It was communication with no designated recipient left at the scene itself. Its function in the analytical framing was closer to inscription than to message. The offender was marking the site of the crime with his own account of it, placing the event within the record he was constructing. Most researchers working within the behavioral science framework have classified the Zodiac as predominantly power assertive in orientation, an offender whose primary motivation is the experience and demonstration of control, who organizes criminal behavior around the assertion of dominance over specific individuals and, through the correspondence, over the much larger collective of investigators and the public. The power assertive category, as developed by researchers including Roy Hazelwood and Ann Burgess, and documented in published forensic literature, typically describes offenders who are organized in their planning, who do not require provocation or a specific precipitating emotional state to commit crimes, and who derive gratification from the experience of exercising control rather than from any response by the victim in the conventional sense. Some academic analyses of the Zodiac case have noted complications within this classification. The letters, read carefully, contain elements that researchers have associated with a preoccupation with capture, specific passages that dwells on the difficulty of identifying the killer, repeated assertions of confidence in his own invulnerability, references to the ineffectiveness of investigators. This pattern, while consistent with an offender who derived satisfaction from the perception of his own superiority, also functions in the behavioral literature as an indicator of anxiety, a specific kind of performance of certainty that can reflect its opposite. The behavioral record does not resolve this cleanly. What it shows is an offender whose communications perform dominance at a high volume and in considerable detail, which most analysts take as the primary motivational signal, while also recording a sustained and detailed awareness of the pursuit, which introduces a secondary layer of complexity that the research acknowledges without fully resolving. The letters addressed directly to law enforcement officials and attorneys represent one of the more consistently analyzed features of the case record. A letter sent to attorney Melvin Belly in December 1969 requested Belly's assistance, identifying the writer as having a problem he could not control and striking a tone that some analysts have read as distinct from the more consistently combative voice of the letters addressed to newspapers. That variation in register has generated discussion among researchers. Some have treated it as evidence of a complex internal state, an offender who in certain moments was reaching for some form of contact or even relief. Others have argued that the variation is itself performative, a different kind of staging in which the apparent vulnerability is a continuation of the same fundamental dynamic of control and manipulation. What the case record shows is a single letter whose tone differs from the predominant register of the correspondence, and the analytical disagreement about what that difference means reflects the limits of what behavioral analysis can reliably establish from a document. The timing pattern of the correspondence also features in the behavioral literature. The early letters arrived in close proximity to the confirmed attacks, sometimes within days, sometimes within weeks. The letters in 1970 arrived at longer intervals, and the communications in the following years were more scattered. The final letter, broadly accepted as credibly authentic, arrived in January 1974, more than 4 years after the last confirmed killing. Within that declining frequency, the elaborateness of individual communications did not consistently diminish. The 340-character cipher arrived in November 1969 at a period of relative communicative activity. The later letters included a 1970 communication with a hand-drawn map and specific location references that investigators pursued. The relationship between declining frequency and maintained elaborateness in individual pieces is consistent with the model of correspondence as primary arena. The communications continued to be carefully prepared and specifically designed even as their arrival became less regular, which behavioral analysts have taken as evidence that the effort invested in them remained high. The analytical question that the behavioral record cannot answer, and that the research acknowledges it cannot answer, is the question of what the offender's internal experience actually was. Behavioral profiling produces a description of the observable pattern of actions and communications. It produces a statistical inference about the type of individual likely to have produced that pattern. What it does not produce, and does not claim to produce, is access to the subjective state underlying the behavior. The Zodiac's letters described his psychological state in his own words, but those descriptions were part of the performance the behavioral analysis is attempting to analyze. They were not transparent reports from behind the performance. What the offender actually felt, what drove him, in terms that are more specific than the motivational categories the research provides, is not something the documentary record can establish. The question of intelligence and social functioning, both elements of the FBI profile, is addressed across the case record in specific ways. The ciphers required mathematical knowledge and cryptographic awareness sufficient to design systems that resisted conventional decryption methods. The letters were largely grammatically coherent, sometimes deliberately fractured in ways that appeared designed rather than uncontrolled. The coordination of communications across multiple newspaper addresses required organizational capacity. The construction of the Lake Berryessa hood required manual skill and deliberate preparation. None of these elements individually establishes a specific level of intelligence or education. Taken together, they are consistent with the profile's characterization of average to above average intelligence and the capacity to function in ordinary social contexts without attracting detection. Investigators interviewed hundreds of individuals over the course of the case's active phases. The person who wrote the letters and who committed the confirmed crimes was not among them, which is consistent with the profile's emphasis on social functionality, the ability to inhabit ordinary life while conducting a parallel private activity of considerable elaborateness. The Lake Berryessa hood sits in the evidence record as a specific physical object described in investigators' documents and in the account that Brian Hartnell gave to investigators in the days following the attack. It was a black fabric hood, sewn rather than improvised, with a bib that covered the chest and a crosshair symbol stitched at the front of the bib in a lighter thread. The hood covered the wearer's face entirely and was designed to be worn over the head and shoulders, leaving only a slit for vision. Constructing it required acquiring fabric, cutting it to the appropriate dimensions, and stitching it, not in the way of a rough improvisation, but in the way of something made with sufficient care to hold its shape when worn. That construction preceded the crime. It was made somewhere at some point before September 27, 1969, by hands that the case record has not identified. It was carried to Lake Berryessa. It was put on before approaching the two individuals at the water's edge. What that sequence of actions tells investigators about the person who carried it out is the specific question the behavioral analysis addresses. The effort of construction, the deliberateness of design, the choice to bring the object to the scene and use it, each of these elements is consistent with an offender whose crimes were embedded in a highly developed internal structure of meaning. The crosshair symbol was already, by September 1969, a documented part of the killer's public identity. It appeared in his correspondence. It was used as a signature. Wearing it physically at the scene of a crime was a specific choice. It connected the physical act to the documented symbolic framework the letters had been building for months. The hood was not a mask in any purely functional sense. It was a costume in the fuller meaning of the word, an object that transformed the person wearing it, at least within the internal logic of the performance, into the character the correspondence had established. Forensic psychology, as a discipline, has developed substantial literature on the relationship between fantasy and action in serial offenders, drawing on research from multiple institutional sources and building on the foundational BSU work from the 1970s and 1980s. Within that literature, the construction and wearing of costumes or props at crime scenes is documented as a specific behavioral indicator associated with offenders whose criminal activity is embedded in an elaborated fantasy narrative. The prop serves the narrative. It is not incidental to the crime, but integral to what the crime means within the offender's internal framework. In the Zodiac case, the hood's stitched crosshair is the detail that connects it most specifically to the existing correspondence, which makes it analytically different from a simple disguise. It was not designed to prevent recognition. It was designed to announce identity. There is, within the behavioral literature on the case, an ongoing conversation about the relationship between the Lake Berryessa costume and the written communications about whether they represent a single coherent psychological framework or whether the crime scenes and the correspondence serve somewhat different functions within the offender's overall behavioral economy. Some researchers have argued that the correspondence was fundamentally a separate parallel activity, that the crimes and the letters were both expressions of the same underlying drive, but operated through different mechanisms and generated different varieties of the same core gratification. Others have treated the correspondence as the primary activity, and the crimes as, in some sense, the content that the correspondence required. The raw material that made the letters credible, that gave them their weight, that allowed the writer to claim the authority the letters performed. Neither position has been established definitively. Both remain within the documented literature as competing analytical frameworks applied to the same body of evidence. What they share is the foundational claim that the correspondence was not secondary to the crimes, that whatever drove the Zodiac Killer to commit the confirmed killings was inseparable from whatever drove him to write the letters. The two activities in every behavioral framework applied to the case are understood as expressions of a single underlying psychological structure, not as unrelated behaviors that happen to occur in sequence. The power assertive classification, returned to in the context of everything the physical and written record shows, remains the most broadly accepted characterization in the academic and investigative literature. The preference for night attacks in isolated locations, the controlled approach and communication at Lake Berryessa before the commission of violence, the public claims of a specific victim count, the threatening of public figures, the issuing of conditions to newspapers. Each of these elements is consistent with an offender oriented around the assertion of control and the demonstration of power over others and over public processes. The elements in the written record that complicate this classification, the passages of apparent anxiety about capture, the single letter to Melvin Belly with its distinctive register, do not override the predominant pattern. They introduce nuance into a portrait that is already, by the nature of what behavioral analysis can establish, incomplete. The incompleteness is not a methodological failure. It is the honest condition of behavioral analysis applied to a case in which the physical evidence was limited, in which the offender was never identified and interviewed, and in which the surviving documentary record consists primarily of communications that were themselves performances. What the analysis produces is a probability framework, a description of the kind of person the behavioral evidence is consistent with, derived from comparative case data and systematic research, carrying real inferential weight but not equivalent to identification. The Zodiac case appears in the published criminological literature not as a case whose analysis is complete, but as a reference case whose behavioral features have contributed to the development of broader research frameworks, cited alongside other anonymous case numbers. Its distinctive elements noted and analyzed, its open status acknowledged as part of what makes it analytically significant. The Black Hood, documented at Lake Berryessa in September 1969, is the detail the behavioral literature returns to most consistently, the single most concrete expression of the internal framework the analysis describes. Sitting in the case record, described in investigators' notes and in Brian Hartnell's account, it is a specific physical object that required deliberate effort to create and deliberate decision to use. Its crosshair symbol, stitched at the front of the bib, faced outward when it was worn. It was made to be seen, not by investigators who would see it only after the fact, and not by the victims it approached, whose experience of it was something the case record holds carefully and without elaboration. It was made to be seen, in the behavioral reading, by the person wearing it, to complete, through the act of wearing it, the identity that the months of correspondence had been constructing in public. The hood was the correspondence made physical. The symbol stitched onto it was the same symbol that appeared in dozens of letters, on dozens of sheets of paper, written and sent and received and processed and held in files that remained, as the years passed, consistently open. What the behavioral analysis can say with the most confidence is that the mind that assembled the hood, that stitched the symbol, that carried it to the lake and put it on, that mind had been thinking for a long time about what it wanted to be. The letters documented the thinking, the hood documented the decision, and the analysis, careful and precise and rigorously grounded in what the documentary record actually shows, arrives at that observation and holds it, a constructed object, a stitched symbol, a deliberate choice, and behind all of it, a mind whose full character the case record describes in detail, without ever quite resolving into a complete picture. That is the condition the behavioral analysis lives in, detailed, documented, well-grounded, and finally limited by the irreducible fact that the person who made the hood and wrote the letters was never identified, never interviewed, and remains within the formal record unknown. The portrait that the research produces is real. It is derived from evidence. It carries genuine analytical weight, and it remains, as it has always remained, a portrait without a subject to hold it against, carefully drawn, held in the literature, and still waiting for the correspondence between its features and a face that the case file has not yet supplied. The streets of San Francisco in the summer of 1969 were still carrying the residue of something that had happened 2 years before. The Haight-Ashbury neighborhood, documented in photographs from the summer of 1967 as crowded with young people and hand-lettered signs, and the particular density of a community that had gathered around a shared idea had by 1969 already begun to change. The crowds thinner, the storefronts altered, the specific atmosphere of that earlier moment already in the process of becoming something to be remembered rather than something being lived. A few miles north and east of the Haight, the offices of the San Francisco Chronicle were continuing to receive letters. The letters were signed with a circle bisected by a cross, and the city in which they arrived was not the same city it had been in 1967, even though the streets had the same names and the fog still came in off the bay, each evening in the same direction. The relationship between a specific crime and the historical moment into which it arrives is never simple or causal. The Zodiac killings did not happen because of the late 1960s, and the late 1960s did not produce the Zodiac in any direct or explanatory way. What cultural historians have documented in published scholarship and journalism examined decades later is something more oblique and more interesting than cause and effect, a kind of resonance between a case and its moment, in which what the case meant to the people living through it was shaped by everything else they were experiencing at the same time, and in which the case in turn contributed to how those people understood the world they were living in. The year 1968, the year before the first confirmed Zodiac killings, had accumulated events that historians across multiple disciplines have identified as collectively reshaping the national atmosphere in the United States. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis in April of that year. Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated in Los Angeles in June, in the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel, 2 months after declaring his presidential candidacy. The Democratic National Convention in Chicago in August was accompanied by violent confrontations outside the convention hall, documented in news photographs and broadcast footage that reached living rooms across the country, crowds in the streets, police in formation, the physical evidence of a moment in which institutional authority and civil society were visibly in conflict. The Vietnam War was escalating, with casualty reports arriving in newspapers weekly and the draft affecting families in every part of the country. These events did not exist in separate categories. They arrived together in sequence over the course of a single calendar year, and historians have documented with considerable consistency that the cumulative effect was a measurable shift in public confidence, in institutions, in authority, in the assumption that the systems governing ordinary life were either stable or reliable. It was into this specific atmosphere that the first confirmed Zodiac letter arrived, in the summer of 1969. The letter was not the first indication that something was wrong. David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen had been killed at a rural road near Benicia, California in December 1968. Darlene Ferrin had been killed at Blue Rock Springs Park in Vallejo in July 1969. These were crimes that had been reported, investigated, and had not been publicly connected to a single perpetrator when the 3 simultaneous letters arrived in July 1969 at the Chronicle, the Vallejo Times-Herald, and the Vallejo Police Department, each containing a portion of a coded cipher and each demanding front-page publication as a condition. The letters arrived in a city, in a region, in a country that was already navigating a sustained period of institutional failure and public unease. The timing was not engineered in any documented sense, but the context shaped the reception. The Manson family murders occurred in August 1969, just weeks after the first Zodiac letters were received. Sharon Tate and 4 others were killed at a house in Los Angeles on the night of August 9th. Leno and Rosemary LaBianca were killed the following night. The investigations were separate, and the two cases represented, as researchers and criminologists have noted consistently in subsequent analysis, entirely different psychological and sociological phenomena. Charles Manson's violence was embedded in a specific communal structure, a defined group, an explicitly articulated ideology, disturbing and particular in its own ways. The Zodiac operated alone, wrote letters in cipher, and maintained what appeared to be a sustained orientation toward media and law enforcement, rather than toward any movement or community. The two cases were not the same. What they shared was a moment, a geography, and a cultural reception that frequently ran them together. Journalists and commentators of the period linked the two cases repeatedly in their coverage, treating them as parallel data points in a larger cultural argument. The idealism of the 1960s counterculture in this framing had produced something other than what its participants had imagined, or had at least failed to prevent something from growing alongside it. The free movement of young people, the loosening of social structures, the open communities and communal living arrangements, and hitchhike journeys across state lines that had been depicted in popular culture as signs of a new kind of freedom. In this journalistic reading, these same conditions had created vulnerabilities, had made certain people accessible, had allowed someone like the Zodiac to move through landscapes populated by people who had been told to trust one another. This framing was not criminologically careful. It conflated very different things. It assigned cultural meaning to crimes whose actual causes and motivations were specific and individual rather than sociological. But the framing was pervasive, and it shaped how the public understood what was happening in ways that were documented in the journalism of the period and examined by cultural historians in the decades that followed. David Talbot, the journalist and historian, examined San Francisco's particular experience of this period in his 2012 book, Season of the Witch, which took its title from the Donovan song and its subject from a specific argument about the city's civic and psychological trajectory across the 1960s and into the 1970s. Talbot's account treated the Zodiac murders as one of a cluster of events, including the Manson killings, the assassination of Mayor George Moscone and Supervisor Harvey Milk in 1978, and the People's Temple mass deaths in Jonestown that same year, that together marked the end of a distinctive period in San Francisco's civic life. In Talbot's documented argument, the Bay Area in the mid-1960s had developed a specific and relatively brief culture of urban experimentation and communal openness, the Haight-Ashbury as a genuinely functioning community, the city as a place where alternative ways of organizing social life were being tested at scale, and that the Zodiac killings contributed to the erosion of that particular civic atmosphere by introducing into it a sustained, unresolved, and publicly amplified threat. This is not the same as saying the Zodiac caused the end of the counterculture. Talbot's argument is more precise than that and more careful. What he documented was the way a specific community experienced a specific series of events, and how those events were woven into the larger narrative the community was constructing about itself. The Zodiac case was one thread in that narrative, not its cause or its conclusion, but it was a thread whose presence was felt across years, not weeks. A case that generated letters, encoded messages, and front-page coverage for years after the confirmed killings stopped, and that in doing so maintained a sustained presence in the public life of the city, in a way that most criminal cases do not. Herb Caen was the San Francisco Chronicle's most widely read columnist for most of the second half of the 20th century. His column ran in the Chronicle for decades, covering the city's social and civic life, with a mixture of affection and acuity that made him, over time, something close to the city's official narrator. Can wrote about the Zodiac case in terms that situated it explicitly within his ongoing commentary on San Francisco's changing identity. The killings, in his framing, were not simply crimes to be solved and filed away. They were events that the city was carrying that had become part of what it felt like to live there, a background presence that altered the texture of ordinary life in ways that were not always easy to name directly. Can's columns on the Zodiac were not sensational. They were the observations of a writer who had been paying close attention to a single city for a very long time and who was noticing, carefully and without exaggeration, what was changing. The specific interpretive template that Can's columns helped establish, the Zodiac case as a symptom of something happening to the city, a marker of a cultural and psychological shift. A case that was about more than its individual crimes persisted in subsequent decades of commentary and analysis. Cultural critics and journalists returned to this framing repeatedly in writing about the case, in film treatments and documentary coverage and academic studies of the period. Can had named something that others recognized, and what he named was not really about the killer at all. It was about the city and the moment and the specific quality of unease that accumulates when a documented threat goes unresolved across months and then years, and the public continues to receive evidence of its continued existence in the form of letters and ciphers and demands. The documented effects of the Zodiac case on public behavior are more concrete than cultural commentary might suggest. Sociological and criminological research has examined the specific practice of hitchhiking depicted casually in popular culture in the 1960s as a normal and common way for young people to travel, embedded in the imagery of the counterculture as a form of freedom and mutual trust between strangers, and has documented a measurable decline in that practice across the late 1960s and into the 1970s. The Zodiac case was not the sole contributing factor to this decline. The Manson killings were part of the picture. Other publicized cases of roadside violence were part of the picture. What research has established is that cases in which victims were approached in vehicles or at roadsides contributed to a documented shift in the publicly understood calculus of risk around that specific kind of exposure. The offered ride, the roadside wait, the transaction between a person on foot and a stranger in a car. This was not irrational. It was a behavioral response to documented evidence. But it was also a change in the texture of daily life, a contraction of a specific form of casual social trust that had characterized a particular period and that began in documented ways to disappear. Market research and consumer data from the early to mid-1970s recorded increases in residential security, product purchases, deadbolt locks, door chains, outdoor lighting fixtures sold in hardware stores that had not seen comparable demand in preceding years. These increases were not caused by the Zodiac case alone. The period saw rising urban crime rates across multiple categories, and the national political discourse around crime and public safety was intensifying throughout the Nixon administration. But research examining the relationship between specific highly publicized cases and shifts in consumer security behavior has identified the Zodiac case, alongside others, as one of the cases that contributed to a measurable shift in how ordinary people thought about the security of their own domestic environments. The hardware store shelf stocked with deadbolts and door chains is not, in this reading, a dramatic image. It is the evidence of a quiet, distributed behavioral response to sustained public awareness of unresolved violent crime, a response that played out in thousands of individual purchasing decisions that aggregated, documented a change. The fear that these changes registered was not primarily a fear of the Zodiac specifically. The documented public response to the Zodiac case was not simply that people were afraid of a particular killer who operated in a particular region. It was something more diffuse than that, a shift in the background assumptions through which people moved through public space, in the degree of casual trust extended to strangers, in the sense of the city and the road and the open landscape as relatively safe environments where encounters with strangers were generally benign. The Zodiac letters amplified this shift in a specific way because they were public. They were addressed to newspapers, printed on front pages, read by the general population of the Bay Area and beyond. The killer's communications were not private threats to specific individuals. They were published correspondence, addressed to the public as a collective entity, and they arrived with a regularity that kept the case in the foreground of public awareness in a way that most criminal cases are not sustained. It is worth pausing on what this meant for the journalism of the period. The Chronicle and the other newspapers that received Zodiac letters were placed in a position that had no clear precedent in the prior history of American crime reporting. The killer's communications were addressed to them directly. His demands that the ciphers be printed on front pages as a condition for withholding further violence made the newspapers participants in a negotiation they had not sought and could not easily refuse. The editorial decisions that resulted to print the ciphers, to give the case sustained front-page coverage, to maintain the Zodiac as a continuing news story across months and years, were not made by sensationalists seeking to amplify a threat for commercial reasons, though the coverage certainly generated readership. They were made by editors navigating a genuinely novel situation in which a violent offender had incorporated the press into his method of operating. The journalism that resulted shaped the public's experience of the case profoundly. It also, as behavioral analysts have subsequently noted, likely reinforced the killer's own understanding of his relationship with the public, a relationship that the letter record suggests he found deeply satisfying. The Bay Area of the late 1960s was a specific and well-documented social geography, and part of what made the Zodiac case resonate so widely within it was the contrast between what that geography had recently been and what it was in the process of becoming. The Summer of Love in 1967 had generated a documented moment in which San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury neighborhood became a focal point for a national phenomenon, a convergence of young people around ideas about community, openness, and a specific kind of social trust between strangers that was the philosophical foundation of the hitchhike, the offered meal, the open door. This was not simply mythology. The photographs and first-hand accounts and journalistic coverage of 1967 documented a real, if temporary, moment in a real place. The Zodiac killings arrived 2 years after that moment, and they arrived in a city that was still processing what that moment had been and what it was becoming. This is the context in which the cultural resonance of the case must be understood, not as a story in which the counterculture produced a killer, or in which the openness of the period created the conditions for violence, but as a story in which a community that had invested significant cultural energy in the idea of openness and trust was confronted with sustained, documented evidence that someone was exploiting exactly those conditions. The emotional weight of this confrontation was not proportional to the number of confirmed victims, which was 5. It was proportional to the duration of the threat, to the public nature of the killer's communications, and to the degree to which the case became a shared civic experience for the people of the Bay Area across a period of years during which other, larger events were also reshaping their understanding of the world they lived in. The cities and highways of Northern California in the early 1970s were different from what they had been 5 years earlier in ways that sociological research has documented through behavioral data and cultural historians have examined through journalism and memoir. The hitchhiked journey across the state was no longer a casual matter. The empty highway shoulder, a stretch of road where in 1965 or 1966 a person with a thumb extended might have waited with reasonable confidence that a stranger would stop, was by 1971 or 1972 a space that people understood differently. This was not only because of the Zodiac. The Manson case had contributed. Other widely covered cases of roadside violence had contributed. A broader national shift in the public understanding of risk was underway for multiple reasons. But the Zodiac case was part of this shift, documented in the record of behavioral change that researchers examining the period have assembled over the subsequent decades. What the behavioral research found, and what the cultural historians corroborated, was that the effects of the case distributed themselves unevenly across the social landscape. Those who lived in the specific geographical areas where Zodiac crimes had been confirmed, the rural roads near Benicia and Vallejo, the state park at Lake Berryessa, the residential streets of Presidio Heights in San Francisco, experienced the case differently from those who knew it, primarily through newspaper coverage. But the newspaper coverage was itself pervasive enough that the case's effects were felt well beyond its immediate geography. The ciphers printed on front pages, the letters demanding attention, the self-assigned tally of victims that investigators could neither confirm nor refute. These were publicly available materials, read by people across the Bay Area and beyond, and they contributed to a distributed experience of the case that made its cultural footprint larger than its confirmed body count might suggest. The question of how a specific criminal case shapes the culture around it is not one that admits clean answers. The relationship between a documented series of events and the broader changes in behavior and belief that can be traced to that period is always partial, always contested, always shaped by what researchers and historians choose to examine and how they frame their questions. What can be said with care about the Zodiac case is that several distinct categories of documented evidence, behavioral research on hitchhiking and residential security practices, cultural history of the Bay Area in the late 1960s and early 1970s, the journalism of the period, as documented in the Chronicle's archives, and Herb Cahen's columns in particular, converge on a shared observation. The case mattered beyond its crimes. It entered the culture in a way that most criminal cases do not, and it shaped in documented and measurable ways how people in the Bay Area and beyond thought about public space, about strangers, about the degree of trust that could be extended in the casual transactions of daily life, the summer of love's specific geography, the hate, the streets leading down toward the bay, the particular architecture of a neighborhood that had for a brief period organized itself around a set of ideas about communal life, did not disappear when those ideas began to dissolve. The buildings remained, the street names remained, the people who had been there in 1967 and were still in the city in 1969 and 1970 and 1971 were living in the same physical space they had occupied during the earlier period, and the contrast between what that space had meant and what it was coming to mean was part of the texture of the period as documented in memoir and oral history and the journalism of writers like Cahen, who had been paying attention throughout. The Zodiac case was not the cause of this transformation. Talbot's argument is careful on this point. The transformation had multiple causes: the heroin that arrived in the Haight in the late 1960s, the exhaustion of the initial communal energy, the commercialization of the counterculture's imagery, the broader national political shifts of the period. The Zodiac was one of several events that contributed to a specific civic experience, not the engine of a transformation it merely accompanied. What the case contributed, specifically, was a sustained and publicly amplified reminder that the openness that had characterized the earlier period was not without cost, that a world organized around the free movement of people, the casual extension of trust to strangers, and the open landscape as a shared and relatively safe commons, was a world in which certain vulnerabilities existed that had not perhaps been fully reckoned with. This is the observation that Cain's columns return to, in different forms, across the period of the active case. Not that the counterculture had failed, or that the idealism of the earlier period had been naive, or that the violence was a judgment on a particular way of living. The observations were quieter than that. They were the notes of a writer who had been watching a city for a long time, and who was noticing, in the accumulation of events across a particular period, a change in something that was not easy to name precisely, but was real, a change in the background assumption of safety, thing in the ease with which people moved through public space, in the quality of the urban atmosphere that Cain had spent decades documenting and interpreting for his readers. The columns were, in this sense, not only journalism about a criminal case, they were journalism about a city in the process of understanding something about itself, and the interpretive framework they established, the Zodiac case as a marker of cultural and civic change, as one thread in a larger transformation that the Bay Area was undergoing, became the dominant framework through which subsequent cultural commentary, film treatments, documentary coverage, and academic analysis of the case proceeded. Writers and filmmakers and historians who engaged with the Zodiac case in subsequent decades were, in many cases, working within a frame that Cain had helped to build in real time in a newspaper column in a specific city across a specific period of years. The Zodiac letters, in this context, were not only evidence in a criminal investigation, they were public communications that participated in the cultural life of the city in which they were received, that were read and discussed and interpreted by people who were simultaneously processing everything else that was happening around them, and that contributed, through that public reading and discussion, to the ongoing civic conversation about what kind of place San Francisco was, and what it was in the process of becoming. There is something particular about the way a case that generates written communications enters the public record differently from a case that does not. The Zodiac's letters were not only read by investigators and forensic analysts, they were printed in newspapers and read over breakfast and discussed on street corners and in workplaces across the Bay Area for years. The killer had made himself, in a very deliberate and documented sense, part of the public discourse of the city. And the public discourse of the city in those years was already occupied with questions about violence and authority and the reliability of institutions that the events of 1968 had raised and that the events of the following years continued to sustain. The result was a kind of cultural saturation. The Zodiac case did not remain at the edges of public consciousness as a distant or abstract threat. It was, for the people of the Bay Area across the years of active correspondence, a regular presence in the newspaper they read each morning, a case whose developments arrived in the same medium as the reports from Vietnam and the coverage of political events, and the commentary of columnists who were trying in real time, to make sense of a period that was not easy to make sense of. What Herb Caen understood, and what his columns documented across this period, was that the case was doing something to the city that went beyond the immediate and documented facts of its crimes. The crimes were 5 confirmed killings and a series of letters. What they produced in aggregate across the specific cultural moment in which they arrived was something larger, a sustained disruption of the background assumption of civic safety that had characterized the Bay Area in its earlier, more expansive period, and a contribution to the broader national mood of the early 1970s, in which the idealism of the preceding decade was being measured against the evidence of what it had and had not managed to produce. The columns themselves are now held in the Chronicle's archive, pages of newsprint, a byline, dates from across the active Zodiac period, the physical form of the interpretive work that Caen was doing in real time as the case developed. They document not only what he wrote, but when he wrote it, and the sequence of when specific observations were made in relation to specific case developments is itself part of the record. The framing that his writing established was not retrospective. It was contemporaneous, built from inside the period it described, by a writer who was living through the same transformation he was documenting, and who had the accumulated attention of decades of writing about the same city to bring to the task of describing what was changing. The observation that the Zodiac case shaped San Francisco's civic identity, and that this shaping was part of a broader transformation documented by cultural historians examining the period, is not a claim about what the killer intended or what his crimes meant in any larger philosophical sense. Crimes do not have meanings in that sense. They have causes and methods and effects, and the effects distribute themselves across the landscape in ways that can be documented in behavioral research, in journalism, in the oral histories of people who were present, in the market data for deadbolts sold in hardware stores between 1970 and 1975. The late 1960s in the Bay Area produced a specific and well-documented moment in which a particular set of ideas about urban life and communal possibility were tested in a real place, at real scale. The Zodiac killings arrived in the final year of that moment, and the years of letters and ciphers and front-page coverage that followed unfolded across the period of its dissolution. The case did not end that moment. The moment had its own internal dynamics, its own contradictions, its own momentum toward change, but the case was woven into the fabric of how the people who lived through that moment experienced and remembered its end, part of what it felt like, from the inside, to live in San Francisco in those years, to open the Chronicle in the morning, to read the columns of a writer who had been watching the city for decades and who was now watching it change. Herb Caen's column in the San Francisco Chronicle, a printed page, a byline, a date from the years when the letters were still arriving, remains in the archive as the physical residue of that contemporaneous observation. What it documents is not only a criminal case. It documents the way a city receives a case, processes it, holds it within the larger narrative it is constructing about itself, and carries it forward into subsequent decades as a reference point for understanding what a particular period felt like from the inside. The framing established in those columns, the Zodiac as a marker of something changing in the city's civic and psychological life, one thread in a larger transformation documented across the years of its unfolding, became the interpretive template through which the case would continue to be understood, written about, and remembered in the journalism and cultural commentary that followed. Not just in San Francisco, in the years when the letters were arriving, but in the decades of careful attention to this record that came after. The case file for the Zodiac Killer sits within the San Francisco Police Department's evidence storage system as a physical, indexed, officially designated collection of materials. It contains original letters, it contains fingerprint cards, or it contains forensic reports accumulated across more than 5 decades of periodic review, each review adding its own documentation to the record without resolving the fundamental question the record was assembled to answer. The file has never been formally closed. It has never been suspended or archived as inactive. In public statements confirmed through multiple decades, the San Francisco Police Department has maintained that this case remains open, not as a formality, not as a bureaucratic designation carried forward by inertia, but as an active investigative status applied to a collection of physical evidence that continues to be examined whenever updated forensic methods make a new form of examination possible. That physical persistence is worth holding in mind as the starting point, not the mystery, not the decades of cultural attention the case attracted, not the theories and counter-theories that accumulated around it in books and documentaries and online forums. The starting point is the file itself, the labeled envelopes, the indexed folders, the evidence bags sealed and cataloged and stored in conditions designed to preserve biological material that might at some future point become newly readable by methods that did not exist when the materials were first collected. The case file is what the investigation left behind. It is what the investigation is still, formally and institutionally, considered to be. The question of DNA came formally into the Zodiac case record in the years following the widespread adoption of forensic DNA analysis as an investigative tool in the 1990s. In the early 2000s, the San Francisco Police Department confirmed publicly that DNA had been extracted from some of the authenticated Zodiac letters, letters that had been handled, sealed, and physically produced by whoever sent them, and that therefore carried the biological residue of that handling on the envelopes and stamps. The partial genetic profile that was developed from those extractions represented, for investigators, a new form of evidence in a case where the physical evidence had long since been fully examined by the standards of earlier forensic science. What the extraction produced, though, was not a complete profile. The biological material on the letters had degraded over the decades since they were first handled. The quality of what remained was limited. Investigators noted publicly that the profile was incomplete and that its usefulness for definitive comparison was constrained by that incompleteness. That distinction between a partial genetic profile and a usable forensic match is the specific point where the DNA evidence in the Zodiac case currently sits. A partial profile exists. It is held in the case file, documented and maintained. It is not sufficient on its own to produce a match through standard comparison methods. It is, however, a form of biological information that had no investigative equivalent in 1969 or in 1974 or in the years when the initial investigation was most active, and the question of what it might yield under future methods remains, as of the case's current open status, unanswered. The 2018 identification of Joseph James DeAngelo as the Golden State Killer produced immediate and documented discussion among investigators and researchers working adjacent to the Zodiac case. The method used in the Golden State Killer investigation was investigative genetic genealogy, a technique in which a partial DNA profile is entered into a consumer genealogy database, compared against the profiles of individuals who have voluntarily submitted their own genetic data and used to identify biological relatives of the unknown individual whose partial profile was developed from crime scene evidence. From those relatives, Genealogists working with law enforcement build family trees outward and then narrow downward, identifying individuals within those trees who match additional criteria such as sex, approximate age, and geographic location until a specific candidate emerges for direct comparison. In the Golden State Killer case, this process produced a direct match. D'Angelo's identity was confirmed through DNA collected without his knowledge, compared against the partial profile from crime scene evidence, and the result was sufficient to support his arrest and subsequent prosecution. Researchers who work on the Zodiac case noted publicly, in documented statements and published analyses following the Golden State Killer identification, that the Zodiac's partial genetic profile represented a potential candidate for the same approach. The technique does not require a complete genetic profile. It requires a profile of sufficient quality to produce meaningful comparisons within genealogy databases that have grown substantially in the years since the method was developed. Whether the Zodiac's partial profile meets that threshold is a technical question that has not been answered in any publicly confirmed law enforcement statement. What is documented is that the discussion took place, that it was taken seriously by researchers, and that it remains an open question rather than a closed one. The 340-character cipher is the specific piece of the Zodiac case record that changed in 2020 in a way that had not been anticipated by anyone following the case closely. The cipher had been received by the San Francisco Chronicle in November 1969, along with a cover letter from the Zodiac. It contained 340 characters arranged in a grid of 17 columns and 20 rows, consisting of a set of symbols, invented letter forms, Zodiac-derived glyphs, reversed letters, and other constructed characters that the killer had used in previous encoded communications. The cipher had resisted solution for 51 years. It had been examined by professional cryptographers, by amateur enthusiasts, by hobbyist communities online, by university researchers, and by investigators with access to computational tools that had not been available in the case's earliest decades. None of these efforts had produced a confirmed solution. The cipher sat in the record as one of several encoded communications from the Zodiac, the longest and most studied of them, and the one that had remained unbroken the longest. In December 2020, a team led by software developer David Orenchak, working in collaboration with a mathematician and a computer programmer, and coordinating their work primarily through online communication channels, submitted a proposed solution to the FBI. The FBI confirmed its accuracy. The solution, when decoded, produced a legible English message in which the Zodiac taunted investigators and referenced his belief that he would not be caught. The substance of the message, as the FBI confirmed it, consistent with the tone and content of the authenticated Zodiac letters, and the solution itself representing the first confirmed decipherment of the 340-character cipher since it was received in 1969. What is notable in the context of the case's ongoing history is the nature of the team that produced the solution. Orenchak and his collaborators were civilian volunteers. They were not employed by a law enforcement agency. They had no formal institutional standing in the investigation. They worked across multiple time zones, using tools available to anyone with a computer and an interest in cryptanalysis, and they produced a result that professional cryptographers and law enforcement resources had not produced in the preceding 5 decades. The solution is now part of the official case record. It exists as a document submitted to and confirmed by the FBI, held in the same institutional framework that holds the original cipher and every other authenticated piece of Zodiac correspondence. What it adds to the investigative record is not a name or a location, The decoded message did not contain information that identified the Zodiac, but it adds the confirmed knowledge of what one of his communications actually said after 51 years of that communication being unreadable. The remaining unsolved Zodiac ciphers continue to exist in the case file alongside the now solved 340-character cipher. The shortest of them, a 13-character cipher sent in April 1970, has not been deciphered, and cryptographers who have examined it have noted that its brevity makes it particularly resistant to analysis, as a very short cipher does not contain enough repetition or pattern to allow statistical decryption methods to gain purchase. Whether the methods that produce the 2020 solution for the 340-character cipher can be adapted for the shorter communications is a question that researchers continue to examine. The institutional history of the Zodiac case includes a dimension that extends beyond the investigation itself and into the documented development of American law enforcement infrastructure. California's participation in the development of regional crime information sharing networks in the decade following the active Zodiac period has been traced by researchers examining legislative and administrative records to include the Zodiac case among the motivating examples cited by advocates for better interagency data coordination. The specific problem the Zodiac case illustrated that a single perpetrator operating across multiple jurisdictions with no shared database could not be reliably identified and connected to his crimes by any individual agency working alone, became one of the documented arguments for the construction of systems that would allow such connections to be made. The FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, established in 1985 and known as VICAP, represented the eventual national institutional response to exactly this kind of problem. VICAP created a centralized database into which law enforcement agencies across the country could enter the details of violent crimes, method, geography, victim profile, behavioral signatures, and against which new crimes could be compared to identify patterns that would not be visible to any single agency working with only its own local records. The Zodiac case, as researchers examining the legislative history of interagency coordination have noted, was not the only motivating example for these developments, but it was among the cases that made the argument concrete and specific. A killer who sent letters to multiple newspapers, claimed crimes across multiple jurisdictions, and operated in a period when California's county sheriffs and the San Francisco police and the Vallejo police had no shared investigative database, provided an exact illustration of the problem that better coordination was designed to solve, that the systems eventually built might, if they had existed in 1969, have made the identification of the Zodiac more straightforward, or might have connected his crimes to crimes in other jurisdictions that were never formally attributed to him, remains a question the record cannot answer. What is documented is that the case contributed to the institutional conversation that produced those systems, and that the systems exist now where they did not exist then. The San Francisco Police Department's continued public designation of the Zodiac case as open and active reflects an institutional posture that itself has documentary weight. Cases are closed for specific documented reasons: an identification, a prosecution, a death of the responsible party, or a formal administrative determination that no further productive investigative action is possible. The Zodiac case has met none of those conditions. The individual responsible has never been identified to the legal standard required for a conclusion. No prosecution has taken place. No death has been confirmed. And the question of whether further productive investigative action is possible has been answered repeatedly by the development of new forensic tools that the case's evidence is still being evaluated against. The periodic revisiting of the physical evidence using updated techniques is itself a documented pattern in the case's history. The DNA extractions conducted in the early 2000s represented one such revisiting. The application of updated handwriting analysis methods to the authenticated letters, conducted at various points in the case's history, represented another. Each of these efforts produced partial information, findings that added something to the record without completing it. Each of them also established, by virtue of having been conducted, that the evidence in the case remained physically intact and held in conditions that preserved it for future examination. The fact that the evidence is still there, still sealed in its original or preservation standard envelopes, still cataloged under its case reference numbers, is not a trivial fact. Physical evidence deteriorates, cases lose materials. The sustained preservation of the Zodiac case's physical record across more than 5 decades represents an institutional commitment that is itself worth noting as a documented fact in the case's ongoing history. The civilian research community that has grown around the Zodiac case over the decades constitutes a separate and parallel form of ongoing engagement with the evidence. Online communities have, at various points, conducted documented handwriting analysis comparisons, geographic profiling exercises, and cipher research efforts using publicly available materials, published reproductions of the authenticated letters, transcriptions of the verified communications, and the accumulated investigative record available through published books and public records requests. The 2020 decipherment of the 340-character cipher stands as the most significant product of this civilian engagement. It also stands as a demonstration that the boundary between institutional investigation and civilian research in this case is not fixed, that a finding produced entirely outside the formal investigative structure can, if it meets the necessary standard of accuracy, become part of the official record. The authenticated Zodiac letters themselves, the ones held in the case file, the ones whose physical forms have been examined for fingerprints and DNA and ink and paper composition over the course of the investigation, were produced by a specific person who was alive and active in the late 1960s and early 1970s. The question of who that person was has not been answered, but the letters exist as physical objects that carry in their paper and their envelope flaps and their stamps and their postmarks traces of whoever handled them. Some of those traces have been extracted and partially analyzed. Some of those traces may yet be more fully readable by methods currently in development or not yet imagined. The letters sit in their evidence envelopes in the SFPD's storage system, sealed, labeled, preserved, and waiting. There is something specific about the fact that the case record contains both the cipher and its solution now. For 51 years, the 340-character cipher existed in the case file as an unbroken code, a message that was known to contain meaning, but whose meaning was inaccessible. The 2020 decipherment changed the character of that document without changing its physical form. The original cipher letter is the same object it has always been. The symbols on its surface have not moved. What changed was the capacity to read them, that shift in which a fixed physical object yields new information, not because the object changed, but because the tools brought to bear on it changed. Describes the general logic of the forensic history of this case and the documented reason why the file continues to be held as active rather than archived. The SFPD building on Vallejo Street is a physical structure that stands in San Francisco as a specific addressable location. Within it, in the evidence management system maintained by the department, the Zodiac case file continues to exist as an indexed collection of folders, envelopes, and physical materials. The file has an official designation. It has a case reference number that has been applied to every document added to it since the investigation began. The materials inside it include items that were handled by whoever committed the Zodiac crimes, and those materials have been tested by every forensic method available to each successive generation of investigators who have worked with them. The case does not have an ending. That is not a failure of the record. It is simply what the record shows. The investigation documented what it found, named what it could not find, and left the file open on the grounds that the investigation had not produced a conclusion. That file continues to exist in exactly the form the investigation left it: specific, accumulated, indexed, and held. The question of what it would take to close a case of this kind, to move it from active to resolved, is itself a question with a documented answer. A conclusion requires either an identification supported by sufficient evidence for prosecution, or a confirmed death of the responsible party with supporting evidence, or a formal administrative determination that no further productive investigation is possible, and that no new forensic tools are anticipated to change that assessment. None of these conditions has been met in the Zodiac case. The DNA evidence remains partial. The genetic genealogy approach remains untested against that partial profile in any publicly confirmed law enforcement operation. The remaining ciphers remain unbroken. The question of additional crimes in other jurisdictions remains formally unanswered. The persistence of all of those open questions is not the same as the persistence of danger. The case is open because it is unresolved, and it is unresolved because the evidence has not yet yielded the specific form of information required to resolve it. The file sits in storage, preserved and indexed, not because the investigation is ongoing in the sense of daily active work, but because the institutional designation of the case as open reflects the honest acknowledgement that a conclusion has not been reached, and that the evidence still held in the file might in the future make one possible. The partial genetic profile is in an evidence envelope somewhere in that file. The authenticated letters are in their separate envelopes. The fingerprint cards, some of them producing identifiable ridge patterns, and some of them not, are in their own indexed location within the collection. The timeline of the confirmed crimes, the dates in 1968 and 1969, when specific named individuals were killed at specific documented locations by a person who subsequently wrote specific authenticated letters to specific newspapers and police departments, is preserved in the investigative record with the same care applied to every other piece of physical evidence. David Oranchak's team submitted their solution to the 340-character cipher to the FBI in 2020 and received confirmation of its accuracy. That confirmation became part of the record. The deciphered text became a known quantity where it had been an unknown one, and the original cipher letter, with its 51 years of unsolved symbols, now annotated by the confirmed decipherment, sits in the file alongside the solution, two documents describing the same communication, one of them produced in 1969 and one of them produced in 2020, together constituting what the case record now holds about what that particular letter said. The Golden State Killer case changed what was known to be possible. It demonstrated in a specific and documented way that a partial genetic profile, one developed from biological material left on physical evidence decades earlier, could be used through investigative genetic genealogy to identify a living individual with sufficient certainty to support arrest and prosecution. Researchers and investigators discussing the Zodiac case in the years following that identification noted publicly that the same logic applied to the Zodiac's partial genetic profile, at least in theory. Whether it applies in practice depends on the quality of the Zodiac profile, on the degree to which the relevant genealogy databases have been populated with profiles from individuals whose family trees might connect to the zodiacs, and on a set of technical determinations that have not been publicly confirmed. Those questions remain open. The discussion of them is documented. The answer to them is not yet part of the record. The length of time the Zodiac case has been open is worth holding as a plain fact rather than a weighted one. More than 5 decades, investigators who worked the original case have retired. Investigators who reviewed the evidence in later decades have retired. The forensic science available now differs so substantially from the forensic science available in 1969 that the two periods are not directly comparable as investigative environments. What connects them is the physical evidence itself, the same letters, the same stamps, the same fingerprint cards, held in the same indexed file, examined by different hands with different tools across all of those years. The Zodiac case entered American culture through the specific vehicle of the San Francisco newspapers that published his letters, and it has remained in American culture through the documented forms of popular attention that followed: books, films, documentary series, online research communities, each of which engaged with the case through the lens of its own period. That cultural persistence is itself a documented phenomenon, separate from the investigative record, though the two are connected. The wide public attention to the case has, at various points, generated new investigative leads and new civilian research efforts, some of which have been taken seriously by investigators, and some of which have not. What the investigative record shows, stripped of the cultural attention and the decades of popular coverage, is a specific set of confirmed crimes, a specific set of authenticated communications, a partial biological profile, a set of cipher documents, of which one has been solved and others have not, and an open case file maintained by the San Francisco Police Department under its official case designation as an active and unresolved investigation. That is what the record shows. That is what the file contains. The building on Vallejo Street stands in the same city where the letters were delivered to the Chronicle building. The case file within it holds the same physical evidence that investigators first collected in the late 1960s and early 1970s, preserved through all the years since then with the care applied to materials that might yet yield something new. The partial genetic profile is still in its envelope. The unsolved ciphers are still in their indexed folders. The solution to the 340-character cipher confirmed by the FBI in 2020 is part of the record now, filed alongside the original cipher that produced it. The case is still open. The file is still there. The evidence that was collected and preserved and periodically examined across more than 50 years continues to sit in its labeled envelopes within an institutional storage system designed to hold it indefinitely. Whatever the file does not yet contain, a name, a conclusion, a final entry that closes the record, it continues to hold everything it has always held, carefully, specifically, in the long patience of a case that has not been given an ending and has not been allowed to become something other than what it is. The questions the file cannot answer are the questions it has always held. Who sent the letters? Why the confirmed crimes stopped? What the unsolved ciphers say? Whether the biological material preserved in the evidence envelopes is sufficient, by the methods now available or the methods not yet available, to produce the specific form of information that would allow the case to move from open to closed. Those questions are still the questions they were when the file was first assembled, unchanged by all the years that have passed, held in the same indexed collection of folders and envelopes that the investigation built and the institution has maintained. The file sits in its storage system in the SFPD building on Vallejo Street. The streets outside are the same streets where the letters were delivered. The evidence inside is the same evidence the investigation collected. The case is still open. The record is still there.